I'm going to give a very brief introduction in the interest of time, only because Professor Davis has a very limited schedule here in Utah. She flew in last night and is on her way back. She also has a presentation in just not a very long time up in Salt Lake City, and so we have to expedite her schedule to allow her to get up to make that presentation tonight. We are very, very honored and pleased to have her here on campus, and pleased that she'd be able to work into her busy schedule a chance to come and meet with faculty and students here at the Kennedy Center. Professor Davis's primary teaching interests are historical and comparative sociology, inequality and stratification, contemporary Chinese society, and methods in fieldwork. In addition to teaching at Yale, she runs a summer fieldwork seminar where Yale students work collaboratively with students from Hong Kong and China. In the past summers, the seminar has investigated such topics as transformation of childhood consumption, changing concepts of privacy and property rights, the uses of public space in new and old residential communities in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and in summer 2004, economic and social change in rural Yunnan. Her publications have analyzed the politics of the Cultural Revolution, Chinese family life, social welfare, class cleavages, and occupational mobility, and she is currently completing 2 books. A Home of Their Own, a study of the social consequences of privatization of real estate in Shanghai, and Wealth and Poverty in China Today, proceedings from a conference held at Yale on how recent Chinese experience challenges prevailing sociological analyses of inequality and stratification. I could go on, but I would encourage you, if you're interested in the full bio, again, download that from our website. We are especially pleased to have Professor Davis with us on campus. Again, her topic is creating wealth and poverty in China. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Davis.
Corey, thank you for a very generous introduction, and also thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I've had a very, very special morning and afternoon with 2 of your leaders, Benjamin and Susan Banks, and I want to thank them very much. I also want to actually say something about the connection between this morning and what I'm going to talk about. I was shown the Humanitarian Center this morning, and then also Welfare Square, Welfare Square, correct. And I came away, of course, extraordinarily impressed by the sophistication as well as the vision with which the church responds to the issues and the suffering of poverty and how one deals with the gross inequities of distribution of resources across the globe. And so I feel I was already humbled at the thought about speaking to this group, and now I'm in a more sensitive position. What I'd like to do there, always, I like to give time for the Q&A, and what that means today is I'm going to go through this PowerPoint and my main argument fairly quickly, so that at least we have at least 15 minutes for the Q&A before I have to leave. And if I can do it more quickly, I will. But I don't want to speak so quickly that you can't follow what I want to say. I begin with, just to remind people who maybe are not as familiar with China, what China looks like, and it's partly also because I want to talk about, I'm going to show slides from several of the fieldwork sites, the Shanghai area and also the Yunnan area. So we know Shanghai is here. It's the mouth of the Yangtze River. It is now this powerhouse, the head of the dragon, as we say in Chinese, for China's forward jump into global trade, and in some cases already dominance of certain areas of manufacturing. And I've been working in Shanghai since 1987. And over that period, of course, I've seen an extraordinary revolution in the quality of the lives of my respondents. The initial study that I did was in one working class area, and I have a random sample of the community, and I've been able then to go back over this 17-year period and re-interview people. And it's given me a tremendous appreciation for the extraordinary speed with which people's lives have been transformed, both materially and politically, culturally, and socially. The other area I've worked in is I have worked in Wuhan, I have worked in Beijing, I have worked in Tianjin, but most recently we are doing a project which is in a poverty alleviation county down here, partway towards the Vietnamese border, and you'll see some pictures from those areas. Now I'm going to lay the stage, as we'd say, the background, for the questions I want to pose to you about where China is going in terms of inequality and poverty, and what are the consequences for social stability and the role of the government in alleviating that poverty. So this is the standard summary. China's growth has been extraordinary. At the same time, the upper one is looking, as you can see, urban disposable income. The lower black line is the rural net income. And really until 1990-92, the gap was there, but it was nowhere near the gap that we see now. And these are not adjusted for inflation, but it still gives you the big picture, which you carry away in your head, that with the acceleration of markets after 1992, the run-up to entering the WTO in 2001, China has increasingly experienced this uneven growth. There was inequality under socialism, but we now have a new dimension, a new intensity to it, in part because people are so well connected. They're also able to see the distortions more clearly than they could in the 1970s. So what is the story of this enormous growth? The first one, the poverty story, is a story of good news. This first slide is from the World Bank, and this is when you look at $1 PPP, purchasing power, parity power, per day in income. And by this measure, in 1981, China had 490 million people living at that level or below, and now it's down to 88 million. In this year, we estimate it may be as low as 65 million. And this is the good news story. It's an extraordinary story. And you can also see that it's changed China's position vis-a-vis other developing countries, that China was way behind other developing countries in terms of the percentage of population living at these low levels of poverty. You're all IS majors or fairly sophisticated readers of the social science literature, and you know that how we measure things can change the story. So the next slide looks at this question briefly about measurement. The bottom line, which shows that now there are only 28 million people in China living in abject poverty, is the official line of the government in China, and that's at 67 cents a day. That's a level of extreme hardship. And again, the story is one of significant gain. The axis here is percentage. So if we start at the, if we want this story here, you can see it's 30% of the population. We're living on this 67 cents a day, and now it's trivial. That group has been not totally, it has been now isolated in a few extreme pockets of extraordinary hardship. We'll talk about, or you may, if you're interested, what the Chinese government wants to do in those areas. The second line is the World Bank income one, which is comparable to the first slide that you saw. The one that most people want to pay attention to if you're in development work is consumption. That is, what is the PPP per day in consumption? So $1 a day in terms of purchasing parity. And that does represent severe hardship. We're not talking about subsistence, but we're talking about hardship. And at that point, it's 160 million people. So there are a lot of people in China who continue to live at a very minimal level and whose lives are very fragile. The ability to sustain a single serious illness is a serious threat to their families' stability and welfare. Now, what has changed quite dramatically in a less positive way in these last 10 years is urban poverty. Prior to the reforms, which start really in 1979-80, poverty was really not known in Chinese cities. Those of you who study China know the socialist revolution in China was one revolution in the countryside, another revolution in the cities. And in 1958, they really enforced a domestic passport system that divided the population into urban and rural and prevented rural people from leaving their villages to move to urban areas. And it was extremely effective. It was not just a paper distinction. It was tied to grain rationing, and it made it impossible, really impossible for a rural-born person to pick up and go to the city for a better job. The only way out was to join the army, which only a small percentage could, about 1 in 1,000, or to get to university, which was even harder. So that China under socialism had this bifurcated system. And what has come with the move to markets, the move to global markets in particular, is a convergence across that rural-urban boundary. It's still there, and you'll see in my discussion how often we toggle between those distinctions. But in terms of this poverty issue, what has happened with the opening of the cities to migrants, the opening of the cities to competition, the opening of the urban economy to global competition is real poverty in the cities, which the Chinese hadn't seen since 1949. So it gets a lot of attention in China. And what I've done in this slide is from my co-author in the Inequality and Poverty book, Wang Feng, who teaches now at UC Irvine. I've taken a slide from a presentation he did in November in China, which says, yes, poverty in China certainly is greater than people expected it before. It's about 12%. But if we look at comparing it to Poland, it looks about the same. And those of you who've looked at the Eastern European experience with capitalism know that this is probably a level that people can live with. This one here is the United States. Now, the criteria for defining poverty when we do it internationally is not this $1 a day. This is 1/2 the median income, and that's the way in which we make comparisons across countries. So it's not an absolute, but it's a relative definition, in which case the United States looks much worse than China. Okay, so overall poverty rates. 12% in the cities and towns, and that's using Asian Development Bank definition for urban hardship. 25% in the rural areas using the World Bank definition of $1 a day in consumption. So this is the thing I think that's rather surprising, which certainly surprised me when I was writing this paper at the end of in December, which is, comparatively speaking now, poverty in China for the nation is actually worse than it is in Egypt and Indonesia. And this was very surprising to me because I think of those countries, particularly Indonesia, as far less robust economies and higher levels of suffering. This is from Aziz Khan, who is definitely not a good news guy. So we think we can trust his estimate, and I think it's an important thing to flag. If I had time, I'd talk now about the government's policy towards poverty alleviation, the 4 phases, and the phase that they're in now, in which this plan for what's called the New Century Poverty Alleviation Program is going to move from a focus on county-level interventions to village-level interventions, which is also where my fieldwork is. What I want to do now, as just an illustration to pique your interest and prompt the questions, is talk about different dimensions of inequality. So first, I just gave this very quick overview of poverty. Okay, we understand poverty. Inequality, of course, is different. In the United States, we have very high levels of inequality, but if we use absolute levels of poverty, we hardly have any poor at all. So we're going to look at income, inequality of income, then inequality in terms of ownership and quality of housing, inequality of health care, and inequality of access to education. And we'll start with the income story. Here what we have is the Gini coefficient, which is the standard international way of comparing distribution or maldistribution of income. And we take the national income and we look how it's distributed across quintiles or deciles of the population. And if every decile gets 10% of the income, you have perfect equality, and the Gini coefficient would be 0. No country is like that. If you had perfect inequality, it would be 1. So the higher the number, the worse you are. And what you can see in China is this steady, inexorable rise from the beginning of the reforms up to where we are now. There's some rise and then dip and then a forward motion. This is the kind of data that supports the frequently quoted observation that China has had the fastest increase of inequality of any country that the World Bank has measured since the end of the Second World War. So this summarizes the story on the income piece. Now I'm going to turn to housing. That is the major book that I'm finishing now. Initially, the study was about housing in urban areas. I'm looking at the meaning of property, what property rights mean, how property rights have been clarified, how property is divided at the death of parents, how property is divided at divorce, and how property owners are organizing themselves in condominium associations and challenging the government to realize the rights that have been promised to them. As I've gone further along with the data collection, I've found I need to narrow the scope more and more, and so ultimately this book is actually about Shanghai, although the larger framework is all of urban China. So the first slide you're going to see is a slide I took at a housing exhibition in 2002, and this was, let me just say something, and because of that urban-rural split, that confined rural people to their villages or even their county towns and didn't allow them to go to large cities. Chinese cities, unlike cities in any other part of the developing world, were tight, compact geographical spaces with very dramatic boundaries between the edge of the city and the edge of the countryside. When they've moved to the new economy, and then when they decided housing development was going to be a driver of the new economy, they had huge, large, really agrarian settings, square, rectangular fields that then were sold off to large developers in which they build these instant towns of between 8,000 and 10,000 households. And initially it was all Chinese builders, and now this is a major destination for international capital, initially from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and more recently from developers from other parts of the world. And so this is a prototype of a town, and 2 years later it actually was built and came to look quite close to it. Just to give you an example of what luxury housing looks like in Shanghai. This is downtown Shanghai, so this is especially expensive, but these are fully occupied large units that are worth about $1 million to $2 million Chinese dollars. And you can divide that by 8 and get some sense of what it might be in US dollars, but you can also divide it by 3, which probably gives you a better sense of the real value. So these are very valuable properties. By contrast, this is a village where we are doing some of our interviewing in 2004. I was in Shanghai in the spring, and I was in Yunnan in the summer. And these people live in an area in which water is a serious problem. They've built their own houses. They had to haul their all the materials, and they do have a large dish, which puts them in contact with the rest of China. Now I'm going to switch quickly to the health piece, which is another area that interests me and that I've been active in. And here I'm drawing on work that these tables come from a recent paper by one of my colleagues who now teaches in Hong Kong, Wang Shaoguang, who is a left-of-center advisor to the current government. He teaches now in Hong Kong, and he's a political scientist. So what we see here is that in this period, since the reforms, the absolute percentage of money that China has spent on health care has doubled. It's gone from 3% of GDP to 6% of GDP. What we also can see is that China now has one of the most privatized health systems in the world. OOP is out-of-pocket spending, and that is the blue line. So you can see this enormous increase in the percentage of this greater amount of spending that's coming directly from people's pockets. The yellow represents social insurance, which is shrinking, almost to the vanishing point. And the red, it represents the government's investment in healthcare, which also is declining very significantly as a percentage. The other problem that occurs in the health area is that the cost, and here we can see parallels in our own country in particular, that the cost of health care has risen much faster than people's incomes. What this means is that health crises are now the #1 cause for pushing people into poverty. And this is a major change for a country like China. It's a poor country, but even when it was very poor, collectivized health care, social insurance programs prevented families from being pushed into poverty by poor health and expensive health care. That doesn't mean people didn't fall into poverty, but what we can now say is that this is the number one cause for pushing people who were not in poverty into poverty, and this is true in urban China now as well as rural China. So this is one of the ways in which inequality and poverty come together, although they certainly can be conceptually distinct. The last slide on this section discussing health issues is from Wang Shaoguang's paper, in which he's trying to place China in comparative perspective. These are studies done by using the World Bank data, which is particularly interested in questions of the fairness of certain kinds of expenditures and how that varies. So on this axis, you can see the government's total spending, which could go from 0 to 100, and then we have the score of fairness by which the payments are made. And this is a calculation which has multiple variables. Probably most people in this room would not disagree with them. I mean, it's sort of a commonsensical way of asking how risk for ill health is spread and how fair that spread of risk is. And China does extremely badly. China used to do very well. In fact, China was the poster child for the World Bank and the UN in how poor countries could deliver middle-income health care. So China had superb life expectancies, infant mortality, mother mortality, very high levels of inoculation across the population before the reforms. And what we see now is some gains in life expectancy, some decline in infant mortality, some decline in maternal mortality, but this crisis of people paying is now on everyone's mind. And so China has now slipped down and has in fact become a poster child for what's wrong with this particular marketization of healthcare, particularly public health. And the SARS outbreak and now the avian flu issue has brought these things to the fore again. People will say, can the world afford China's decision to privatize public health? Now, the last thing I'm going to end on is more of the good news of still inequality, but it is, I think, generally a positive story, and that's the extraordinarily significant gains in education. China did very, very well in the 50s, the 60s, compared to Indonesia, Ghana, Pakistan, any large agrarian capitalist society in pretty much wiping out illiteracy among people who were young enough to get to school. And they did it for girls as well as boys. So China stands head and shoulders above most of the developed world in having a population that is literate and numerate, and therefore a particularly attractive workforce for international corporations. So it's healthy, hardworking, disciplined, literate, and numerate, and easy to train to do ever more sophisticated work. So what this shows us here is looking at how things have changed in this new era, which is not only an era of marketization, but it's also the era of the one-child policy, which begins in 1980. So that China also has this bonus, in contrast to the rest of the developing world, is that they have increasingly fewer children to educate at higher levels. And this they are taking advantage of, and it's definitely to the benefit of the individual children and their families. So if it's color-coded, we still have, if we look at the year 2002, a society in which most of the children in schools are in primary school, but then when you go down to junior high, which is only 3 years, you can see that it's more than half the numbers that are in primary school. So what they have been able to do since 1986, when they made 9 years of school mandatory, is in fact fulfill their mandate. I am not saying there aren't some children who don't finish ninth grade. There certainly are. About 15% of the age group, we estimate now. It's fantastic. This is a great achievement. The next band down is looking at vocational and technical, and then senior high school, which is the only gateway to college education. And here, until very recently, they held back, and that's where the gap then really opened, with rural children making it through junior high, but of a substandard curriculum, and urban children making it through senior high school, which then allowed them to make the step to university. This also is being addressed now, and the expansion at the tertiary level is extraordinary. About 20% of the age group now is in tertiary education. Nobody would have believed that 5 years ago. The other thing I want to flag is this question of male-female inequality, which in the third world, the developing world, the world of $1 PPP per day, poverty, Chinese women, girls, have really caught up to boys at every single level of education. They are less than 50%, but that's also because girls are less than 50% of the population. I'm not saying there's no discrimination. Of course there's discrimination. And if parents are really impoverished and they have to choose between a boy and a girl, in some parts of China they tilt to boys. In our research in Yunnan, however, we found that parents tilt to the child who does the best on the standardized exam, which is very often a girl. So actually our model that we ran and shook as hard as we could shows that boys in poor families are the ones who often are at the greatest risk if they haven't reached a certain kind of level of academic achievement. And that was a surprise to us. I just want, again, just some pictures for those of you who haven't been to China to give you also a sense of the dramatic variation between different parts of the country. So this is the attached primary school and junior high to a university in Shanghai. These are just fantastic schools with fantastic teachers, extraordinary curriculums, world-class in every level. The next one is a picture of a school in the village where we did interviewing, and this is typical of lots of rural schools. However, the quality of the teachers in these schools is often far, far better than the school itself, and this is important to remember, that the exterior doesn't really fully capture the quality within those walls. Our team in Yunnan is composed of the Yale students, the Hong Kong students, and the students from Beijing and Kunming, the capital of Yunnan. But we have them matched with teachers from this particular county in each of the interview teams. So there's one local person and one outside person in each of the household interview teams. And working with the teachers, living with the teachers for a month, I got to know them pretty well, and I was left enormously impressed, not only about their formal education, but about the sophistication with which they read the social environment and their ability to keep learning new things. It was, as I said, heartening, and that was the good news side. The medical side, the other book that it's just a conference thing I'm finishing, is on SARS. So I have, when I talk about SARS, or I talk about avian flu, it's harder to end as much on a positive note. When you turn to education, the story can still be of enduring poverty, although falling, increasing inequality when we look at income, but across the country, an investment in education by the communities, by the central state, and also by the parents, that really puts China in a very good position for the next 10 years. I just want to flag what I mean by this, what the the investment here. China has a central ministry of education, and there is a curriculum which basically is the same across this country of 1.3 billion people. It's slightly changed from province to province, but basically it's a standard curriculum because there is one university entrance exam that everybody takes across the entire country. So everybody is teaching to those tests. They are achievement tests. They're very high levels of achievement, and that means that even if you're going to a school that looks like the one on the slide here, you and your teachers are mastering and the same calculus, physics, and chemistry as the students in that other building. You won't have the same lab facility, you won't have the same computer connection. There'll be something that's missing, but the opportunity for kids across China to achieve high levels of mastery is really impressive. So, ending now, give a chance for our questions. I wanted to just highlight 3 questions. What are the challenges for the near future? One is, will this income inequality keep increasing? I don't think so. The main driver of this really widening gap between rural and urban areas is this gap between rural and urban areas. And in the last 5 years, there have been massive changes in the migration process, and they plan to end this passport system and merge, erase that boundary. And as you allow the people from the poorest areas to migrate on their own to find jobs, the inequality that we see now between urban and rural is going to change. The overall inequality is probably going to continue to increase in the range of the United States, because the elderly and the middle-aged who are never going back to school and who are in horrible jobs or no jobs or in poor health are definitely vulnerable in this market economy. So that aspect of the drivers of the inequality we see are going to continue. But I don't think we expect to see the growing gap as we saw across the 90s when it just exploded. The second question is whether these income inequalities that we flagged are going to compromise sustained economic growth. And here also I don't think they are. First, as I've stressed when describing the educational investments, the human capital capacities in China are enormous. And the response to income inequality is, of course, for young people to invest in their education, to compete in the labor force, and to try to move ahead. The faith in the system is still very strong. The second reason is what's driving the economic growth in China is FDI, foreign direct investment, which shows no sign of pulling out. China is the #1 destination for foreign direct investment, and as opposed to the U.S., which was used until 2 years ago, was #1, or 3 years ago, in China this is going into production. It's going into manufacturing. It's going into further economic productivity, which drives the economy forward, and the income inequality does not really undercut that. The third is that there really is a strong family structure in the Chinese case, so that inequality, that disaster of poor health that knocks out one brother does not limit the chances of that brother's child drawing on other family resources to get ahead. There are many ways in which a strong Chinese family still cushions the inequities of that rising inequality. I don't want to paint this in a totally glorious, rosy picture. There's lots of pain, there's lots of conflict, but it's not going to reach this critical issue that many people ask about, of actually undercutting the growth that's currently there. The last question is the political one, and this gets to the level of conjecture. We do our best in social science. We call it hypotheses. So will income inequality polarize the society politically? The most recent surveys, one has been done by Martin White at Harvard, and there is another one that has been done by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They find that people are very optimistic about their futures still, and that actually those who are at the lowest incomes are more optimistic than those with higher incomes. The other thing that we see happening in the last 2 years under the leadership of Hu Jintao, the successor to Jiang Zemin, is an effort to put issues of inequality on the front burner at all levels of politics. One way we see this is the Gini coefficient in China is somewhere between 0.41 and 0.46. The Chinese public press and even fairly ordinary people in China will ask me, do you think that with a Gini of 0.45 we're in the red zone? You know, I mean, this level of popular concern about inequality, in fact, is indicative of a society and a leadership that actually is sensitive in its Leninist way to these issues. So again, the final takeaway is that I am cautiously optimistic. So now we have time for questions.
curious on why Yunnan was chosen.
The question was why we did the survey in Yunnan. We were actually asked to do that project by a Chinese philanthropist who is from Yunnan and had a particular project that they wanted to do in that county, and it was about building libraries. And I suggested that before they build the libraries, we should do a survey to see, it's a hierarchical model, so we could see which villages were doing the best with what they had. And that's why we went there. Yeah.
If the housing development that's being done in the Chinese cities is kind of more on a higher level, how are poorer rural people going to be able to move in and get jobs and be able to afford to live in the
The question was about the high price of urban housing and what this will mean for rural migrants. It's a great question. Because land in China is still owned by the state, rural people, through their villages, all still have land in their villages, and housing is generally relatively good quality, and most people have built, literally most people have built new homes since 1980 in the villages. So when they go to work in the cities, they've left a piece of their land sitting on a house sitting on a piece of land in their home village. When they come to the city first, they will live in dormitories. If they're construction workers, they live on the site. Now we're seeing the second wave of immigrants who are coming with their families, and since the rule's going to change, to let them settle. I just showed pictures of one high-end because quickly I was going through it. There is a huge supply of second and third tier housing which has now entered the market. So there's what they call in China a secondary market. And when you get outside of these Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou areas, there's a huge range of housing available. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but there actually is a market for different levels. And migrants who move are the ambitious migrants who have a job, and they do not see it impossible for them to make it into the market now. Whether that will continue, I don't know. Yeah.
My question is somewhat related to that. As they take down the barrier between rural and urban areas and people migrate to the cities, China has this huge foreign investment. Is there enough jobs for everybody who moves to the cities? Can they find jobs? What kind of work do they do?
The question was about employment, and are there really enough jobs for 1.3 billion people? No, China has a serious underemployment and unemployment issue, which they talk about, outsiders talk about. This FDI that has gone in and created the factory of the world has provided jobs for rural youth who previously were farmers. And about 30 million people who used to have industrial jobs have lost their jobs and not gotten them. So China, in what they call their Rust Belt, mainly in Manchuria and Western China, are serious problems of hardcore unemployment. So there's unemployment problem, and it's concentrated in particular urban areas. The thing that keeps so far China from having the kind of crisis or pattern that India had, and I would guess maybe Brazil has also had, is that people who leave the villages are people who are aspiring to something better. And if all fails in the city, they still can go back to the village because the land is still there. There's not a landless peasantry as there is in most capitalist developing countries. Somebody in the back of the room first, yeah.
Now, with the upcoming Olympics, what do you foresee will be the effects of China in the world markets and domestically in China?
I don't understand. You want me to connect the Olympics to... The first thing on the Olympics, is that China has used that, as all countries that have gotten the Olympics, to upgrade their infrastructure enormously in the capital city. Now, there's political fallout all over the rest of the country who are really peeved. They are, first, great, we got the Olympics. That was euphoria. We're here, we're modern, we're great. And then, because I was working in Shanghai, I immediately heard it. But then he said, we're spending all this money to build them roads and build them a stadium, and what did we get? So the Olympics has brought to Beijing important infrastructure, and hopefully it already will clean up the air. And so because they have to shut down industry, they're trying to say it's green enough for the athletes. So there's a whole piece now about green growth in China, and that's very positive. So, but yes.
What is the most important thing that the United States or Western society can do to help improve the poverty situation in China?
The question was asking what can the U.S. do to improve the poverty situation. There are many NGOs working in China. The fourth phase that they have, the 21st policy, they explicitly say that there is a role for NGOs, both foreign NGOs and domestic NGOs, and that I think is positive in many, many ways, and opening up a way for civil society both domestically and internationally. And there are many different ways in doing it. As I said, the medical piece of this is really the frailest and the most problematic. And people have gone in different ways. Sometimes it's providing surgery techniques, going to more outlying places and upgrading the training of physicians who are in these poverty-stricken areas. Other ways it's moving together to talk, how could they devise better ways of spreading the costs. The other ways is having a Chinese, which is not hard to do, join in international programs and interventions. So they are, what we would call, working at an international level, which makes people see options that they wouldn't otherwise see. I mean, there are many, many ways, and I think China's moving much more quickly in that direction than I would have expected. Yeah.
I had a question about you did work in Yunnan. Was there any discrimination towards minority groups, since Yunnan has such a high minority population? And also the other question I had was there any shift in family relations? Is all these rural people are coming out of rural areas and they're younger and they're more able? What's happening to the older generation back at home? Are they separating, or are they still coming back after they make the money?
Okay, two questions. One was about the elderly and when the young go to the cities, and the second one was about minorities, particularly in Yunnan, which is 40% what they call non-Han, mostly Yi, Miao, Zhuang, Dai, and Tibetans. Within Yunnan, because people tend to live in communities with people of their same subgroup, the discrimination doesn't work that way. And it's hard to disentangle discrimination against poor, uneducated people and discrimination against particular minority groups. What we found in our county, which surprised us, was the high level of intermarriage. And certainly depends at what level you want to enter into it. Certainly in Beijing, certain things can be more polarized. There's more politics to it, and so inter-ethnic tensions are important in China. They do not seem in Yunnan to be related to either current social unrest, which is more related to issues with crime and drugs and the border with Burma and Vietnam. On the elderly, the first book I wrote was on the elderly in China, which ended the second edition was 1990. This out-migration is seriously compromising care for the elderly, and in some parts of China, it's already pretty well documented. They are definitely vulnerable, and people are worried. Yeah, in the back.
I've heard a little bit lately about the return of the Barefoot Doctors in the rural areas. I was first wondering if that's true, and second, do you think that will help lessen the healthcare and income troubles in the rural areas?
The Barefoot Doctors, that expression was used for paramedics who were trained in the late 60s and 70s, the Cultural Evolution decade, and it brought out usually people who had junior high education and trained them first in the commune center for 3 months and then brought them back, and they were the first line of care in the collective healthcare sector, which completely collapsed in 1983. Half of the Barefoot Doctors went on to do whatever else they wanted to do, and half of them went into private practice. So in the areas where I was in Yunnan, many of the healers, and a lot of them mix now Chinese traditional medicine, or they already did, with their Western, they've set up clinics. So when you said a return of Barefoot Doctors, I'm not sure exactly who you would mean. I don't think the people who were previous Barefoot Doctors set up in private practice are now in their 50s and 60s are going to go back to the old method. There is a whole rethinking of how to restore the public health sector, which they started after SARS. And as they think about both HIV, AIDS, dealing with that, and this avian flu, which are the top public health ones in the international forum, then there's discussion about what kind of paramedical people do you want in villages. So in that respect, definitely public health now thinks of nurse, what we would think of visiting nurse kind of, it would then have a circuit through which they would go so that they would make, and they already do that for school admissions. So these people will go, and so every child needs to be inoculated if they can't go to school. And then I saw it mainly with animals when I was there for hoof and mouth disease. But that's, if you mean that, I think there is thinking now about how, again, to restore a good paramedic piece of public health. But I don't see any evidence that they're going to go back to having local, publicly financed clinics in every village. Sure. In the back.
You talked about how sorry.
That's the last question. Yeah.
Okay. You talked about in Shanghai how the urban, like foreign investment and stuff. Do you think that with Shanghai opening and having such a huge foreign business population and hence their foreigners, is it fueling the inequality that exists there?
The question was about how having more foreigners in Shanghai widens the gap. The gap is widened structurally. That is, the character of the economy in Shanghai is lots more high-end, high-tech jobs, some of which are joint ventures and are foreign-owned. Most of the foreigners in Shanghai are Taiwanese, and they pay Taiwanese wages, or if you're talking about 3M, Cargill, et cetera, these big American MNCs, they also pay, an international wage. Whereas this vast army of rural kids coming in to work in the service sector, restaurants, a whole range of things, the labor market, in other words, sets the price. And so to that extent, we would say foreign investment by creating these jobs, these high-tech finance, insurance jobs, which are really at the international level, paying international wages, is one of the things driving this huge gap. Okay, thanks very much.